Okay, so welcome everyone to our fiction editor guest lecture. Soon our trainees will be studying the role of fiction editor. So our guest, Teague von Bohlen, will give us some insight today on the work that he does as the fiction editor of Coppernickel, which is the literary magazine based in University of Colorado, Denver. And as you've read in his bio, Teague is an award-winning writer and professor, and he's also an ASU alum. So thank you, Teague, for being here with us today. Our interns have spent the past month going through the selection process for our upcoming issue 29. And at Superstition Review, we look at three things: content, craft, and composition to guide our selection process. So I'm curious, can you tell us about the selection process you have at Coppernickel?
Yeah, it's actually different at varying levels, right? So our initial the slush pile, if you will, and that's the level at which our students primarily work. The students get together once or twice a week, depending on their schedules, and compare notes. They take notes on everything that they read. They have to come in with a certain number of comments based on some criteria. If they're voting yes on something, a new thing that we've implemented is that they have to specify very specifically what it is that drew them to that story. Like, if you were trying to sell that story to me, how would you sell that story to me? And that kind of cuts through. That's worked pretty well so far. It cuts through some of the interim sort of talk. It saves us some time, and we get so many submissions now that saving time is one of those things that we've really had to start doing. So we don't have a specific level of we have no. There's not like three criteria like you have. It sounds like you guys have. But we do have specifics that they can choose from to talk about in their review process. And in those meetings, it's very collaborative. And on the fiction side anyway, I'm not sure this is true for poetry, but we work very much on consensus on the fiction side. So in the end, everybody has to sign on. That's sort of that's the agreement. And so sometimes that means there are some sort of, deals made between students. Like they'll say, I'll support that story if you can give me this piece of flash. And that's fine, whatever horse trading has to go on. I guess that's part of the process. So that's the slush pile level. And then they get kicked up to a student lead editor level. And that's really more of like a safety net, so that that editor can look through the list before they send it to me and make sure that everyone's on the same page, verify that the stories are have notes in, because we use Submittable, so that we have the notes in Submittable, and sometimes those either get lost or don't get inputted, and so we make sure that all's correct. And then it gets kicked up to my level, and I disseminate it out to other fiction editors at the faculty level, and then we talk about those. I work closely with our fiction leads. I don't necessarily see the students reading the slush more than a few times this semester, but they definitely work their way up. We're lucky enough to take a small crew to AWP every year, and so we've got 5 students total going this year, which is cool.
Yeah, that's very similar to Superstition Review. We also use Submittable, and we trade notes with our faculty advisor and Trish. So that's really cool to learn about how the students are involved in the process.
Submittable is an amazing tool. I don't know. Yeah. I'm old enough that I remember very well not having Submittable, and it was a completely different animal. Trish can back me up on this. I mean, back when in the dark ages of the US mail delivering actual manuscripts, and us having to read them. And that's really where Copper Nickel began back in the day. It was, we didn't go digital till I think our third year, and we didn't do Submittable till a little bit later after that. Yeah, it was a very different process back then. A lot more paper files to have to deal with.
Yeah, and superstition review is done completely online. So without Submittable, it'd be very hard.
Yeah.
So I read on the Copper Nickel website that you have a particular interest in work with social historical context. And I was wondering like how much you pay attention to that when you're going through submissions, and just personally, what other things are you drawn to when you're looking at work?
Yeah, the socio-historical context actually came from Jake Adam York, who was my colleague. He was really the one that started Copper Nickel. I helped. I was like his flunky for a while in the very early years. And that was really his sort of focus and his passion. And that really carries on primarily through the Jake Adam York Prize that we have established, that we give out yearly we alternate fiction and poetry every year. And that really focuses on work that has either a historical or a sociological bent or importance or emphasis. I would say that the journal itself still attracts that, mainly because of Jake's legacy. Jake unfortunately passed away years ago. He was very young, he was 40. But his legacy really, we work to keep that legacy alive. That's why the prize is named for him. I would say that we have branched out a little bit in terms of at least on the fiction side. The poetry still hews a little closely to that aesthetic. But on the fiction side, we really cling to it's kind of a cliche now with literary journals, but we really want to publish the stuff that we fall in love with. I mean, if it really doesn't matter ultimately what comes across our desk if we really can champion it, right? We have to be careful with that. We learned a lesson very early on I think it was I want to say the second or third issue, very early. And we weren't getting a lot of submissions at the time. We were begging people for submissions. But we got this really quirky little, it was really not even a story, it was a vignette, but it was a post-apocalyptic vampire on a motorcycle story. Just nothing we would probably publish now, but at the time we were like, well, this is kind of cool. And we published that in, like I said, issues 2 or 3. And for literally 3 or 4 years after that, we would every crop, we would get at least a few post-apocalyptic vampire on the motorcycle stories, which you wouldn't think there'd be that many of those, but there are plenty. So we do have to be careful with, we understand that in a lot of ways we are programming our future issues based on our selections now. And so we really strive for quality above all else. Style is something that I think can vary a little bit for us. My only sort of quirk in terms of what I'm looking for is that I tend to look at all the flash fiction that comes in because I've worked in that area for years now, edited specifically for a magazine before that was devoted to just flash fiction. And so most of that gets sort of funneled through me anyway. But I'm really the voice championing that, just like in a similar fashion, Wayne Miller, who is our managing editor, is very much a fan of translations. And so he's the one that looks at all the translations and chooses those almost independently. And without his input, I don't know what we'd do in terms of translations. We only started accepting translations when he joined our team. So we all bring a little bit something different to the table. And stylistically speaking, the other people on the fiction board, I tend towards fiction that's a little bit more either traditional in terms of voice and style, or very alternative in terms of like magical realism or alternative sort of forms. I have another reader who's absolutely addicted to very complex narratives that are almost unattainable. I mean, it's like very hard work to get through those stories. It's totally worth it, but it's not what I love on a personal level. And so I have to look at it with a different kind of eye when I'm reading stuff that she says, this is awesome. Because I know right off the bat, I'm going to be like, I'm going to have to appreciate this. I'm not going to be able to love it and hold it close to my heart, but I will be able to appreciate it. And so those relationships and those peccadillos sort of all work together to mash up into what Coppernickel then becomes.
Yeah, and I think I'm guessing that your experience submitting to literary magazines yourself probably influences your role as an editor. You've submitted to a lot of places, including Superstition Review issue 10, I think. So yeah, can you tell us what that process influenced in your work as an editor?
Yeah, I think editing has made the submission process more bearable for me as a writer. I don't think anybody likes submitting their work. Maybe they do. Maybe there's some weirdos out there that really love it. But generally speaking, I don't think it's anybody's favorite thing. Most writers really just want to write and have it be appreciated in some way, shape, or form and be left alone. So the ego bruise that can happen when you get when you send out a submission to get, and then it comes back to you with a no thank you. It's a little easier to take once you've been that person who's doing the ego bruising, because you know that it's not always about the quality of the work. It's often about, we just published something that was very much like this 2 issues ago, and we don't want to repeat that as a pattern. Sometimes things are just very close with other vying for the limited space in a print issue, and something comes very close to making the cut and something else just edges it out. There are bizarre things that happen in the selection process that really help remind me as a writer that it really is, there's definitely an element of luck in that, and sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not, and that's okay. That's the business. I think it has also helped in the sense that I learned how to pinpoint my markets a little bit better, and pay attention to what journals were saying that they wanted, not only in terms of absolutes and following those rules, not thinking, I think all writers start off thinking, well, they're going to fall in love with this story because it's so awesome. And then despite the fact that it's double the length that they'll accept their maximum, and they won't. That's not the way that the business works, right? So paying attention to those things is, I think, part of it, but reading between the lines, learning how to read between the lines in terms of what they want. And sometimes it's as simple as, if they say we're not super happy with the influx of second person stories, we're kind of tired of that. Taking that seriously too, and even though it's they're keeping the door open, you should, recognizing that door is not open like this much, it's open like this much, right? And if that's the case, you don't submit a second person story to them. I think it's also, there's also a sort of collegiality. There's no quid pro quo in publishing, not that I've experienced primarily. but there is a sort of like, once you're in the mix, people recognize your work from another journal, and then they might that's where they find you to ask you for work directly for a journal that they're working on, and that the ball starts rolling a little more naturally that way. That's the way it's supposed to work, I think. I think that's why we have things like AWP, and we have gatherings, and people pay attention to the journals that are out there alongside the one that they're working on. You want to know what other people are doing, because you want to know who you can attract to your pages too.
Yeah, I think for people who do submit, it's definitely really important to do your research on the magazines you're submitting to.
For sure.
And I'm actually curious, is how often do you accept a story that you that requires editing?
That's a really good question. I think it was more common for us 5 years ago than it is now. And that, again, is more of a function of time than anything else. We just don't have the time to work with authors in the same way that we once did. And I kind of miss that. I mean, there are some of my favorite stories from the past were ones that we had to work through with authors a little bit. So that's sort of a benefit for journals that are sort of on the rise still. I think that it's strange. The writers that I've worked with where we've said, look, we like this, but you've got to change that ending or whatever it is, right? Those writers, for whatever reason, tend to be, I think, happier than the ones that just get an acceptance, right? Like a flat acceptance, like, yes, we're gonna take this. It'll be, in our print issue in whatever 14 months or so. That's pretty much how far out we work now. That's kind of one level, and I get to meet those people at AWP normally, and they come by and say, thanks for publishing, and here's who I am, and that's always great. But the interaction between the people that you're actually working with to get a story really, solid, I think that develops relationships that pay off in, I think, even bigger dividends. So we still do it once in a while. I would say primarily we do it with writers that we have solicited, and we don't want to say, hey, send us something, and then say no. So we'll, the last time I did it was on a piece of Flash from Kathy Fish, with a story called Bear Walks Into a Bar. And that was a cool experience, because then that story went on to get published in Best American, which was cool. It pays off. It pays off.
And how often do you solicit work? Do you wait until you don't have enough submissions?
Well, that's what we used to do. That is what we used to do. No, because we're working so far out, I tend to solicit. Well, pre-pandemic, I would solicit everybody, all the fiction writers we would bring in for readings. Partially just because it seemed like the right thing to do. If we love their work enough to bring them in, we certainly should love their work enough to publish it. And so not everybody took us up on that, but a lot of people did. And we also have editors who will suggest someone that they've read, somebody that they've met at a conference, and we'll solicit them. But again, we have so many submissions that we have to be careful that we're not soliciting too much, because down that road lies sort of the rarefied air of the New Yorker and the Atlantic and all these magazines that are fantastic, but almost impossible to get into if you're not, Steve Martin or somebody.
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open up to our audience. If you guys have any questions, you can write it in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask Tage your question. So while we give everyone time to type their questions,
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there any trends you see right now with the submissions you're getting that is really interesting, or any popular trends that are going on? I think with Superstition Review, we have seen a lot of COVID-related subjects and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. The COVID stuff is just starting to roll in. I think we just in the last, I would say, 6 months, we've seen a huge influx of pandemic related work. And it's oddly, a lot of it is also sort of writer focused. So it's writers in the pandemic, writing about writing in the pandemic. And we're definitely having to put a cap on the number of things that we accept that are pandemic related. We do not, as I put it to a couple of my fiction staff, we do not want to have like an all pandemic issue on the fiction side anyway. So we don't do theme issues anyway, but a pandemic issue would be especially, I think, I don't know. We're also over it. I just don't know that there's that much of a market yet for people wanting to write or to read about it. There was a lot of people, there were a lot of people, a lot of writers in isolation in the pandemic writing about that. There were a lot of writers clearly, we see, especially post-pandemic, we've seen a number of things that clearly were inspired by the binge watching of television during the pandemic. So I remember I read just in the slush pile, and when I say slush pile, these are the ones that have been passed forward to me, right, from our editors. By the way, this on my wall is my list of things I've got to read. You can see how long this is. I just put them under there. But yeah, one, this was, oh gosh, probably 6 months ago now, last fall, but I read 3 stories in a row that used the show Tiger King as a major point in the formation of the story. And, it's just one of those things where I don't know, there do seem to be these topics that come up and people latch onto, and then you'll see like a rash of them for no apparent reason. It's not like we've published a lot of Tiger King related material, but there it was.
Yeah, and Taylor's has a question that's a little related. So are there any trends that you've seen in fiction that are so overused that you wouldn't accept them?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's anything that we would reject out of hand because of its style or form or anything like that. I think there are certainly things that we've seen a lot of. I mentioned earlier the sort of second person story really had its heyday about 10 years ago, maybe more now. And it's, I wouldn't say it's overused, but it's definitely not the alternative form that it once was. It's very much not enough to hook an entire story to. I would say that any genre bending stuff has to be very careful. And again, some of that comes from the influence of binge watching stuff. I remember back when everyone was waiting with bated breath for the last season of Game of Thrones. We got a ton of like fantasy genre bending kind of stuff, and a lot of it didn't bend it enough, and it was just really a genre piece. We saw a lot of zombie related stuff as well, especially after Kelly Link's collection came out, which is fantastic. But again, if you as a writer are basing something you're doing on an inspiration that you got from another writer, by definition, that means it's already been done. And so you've got to really bring something new to the table for that. And that's why I think we don't accept those, because it's somebody jumping on a bus that's already, 3 stops past.
And do you check with the other, like with poetry to see, and nonfiction too, to make sure that the issue is more diverse in topic?
I don't. That's really Wayne's job as the managing editor. I think he really looks at the issue as a whole and makes sure that we're not duplicating things in terms of theme, for example. And that's happened before, where because we don't have theme issues, we don't want to accidentally fall into one, right? And so I remember a few issues ago, I don't even remember what story this is now, but I remember Wayne saying we're going to push this story off to next issue because there's a few poems in here that kind of have a very similar feel to them, and we don't want those messing with each other. So the big picture is really more about Wayne. We look at big picture in terms of the stories that we're selecting, and we try to be really it's really about being as variable as we can in terms of length, in terms of style, in terms of subject, in terms of approach. We try to mix it up as much as possible because we think that that's going to appeal to the largest section of our readership.
Okay, so we're coming up on time here, so I'll just thank all the trainees and interns for coming today. I hope that you learned a lot from our conversation with Teague. Thank you so much, Teague, for giving us your time today.
Absolutely, happy to do it.